If you want to understand real influence, forget everything you've been told about impressing, persuading, or proving value. The mind is not seduced by effort, it's seduced by contrast, by presence that feels different from what she's used to. Most men try to win attention by adding more words, more interest, more reassurance, but the mind responds to subtraction, to what isn't said, to what isn't rushed, to the space where curiosity starts working on its own. Mental attraction begins the moment you stop trying to be understood. When you no longer explain yourself excessively, justify your choices, or over-communicate your intentions, something shifts. Her mind starts filling in the gaps, and whatever the mind fills in feels more real than anything handed to it directly. This is why mystery isn't about being vague, it's about being self-contained. You don't hide information, you simply don't leak your internal world for approval. What pulls someone in psychologically is emotional contrast. Calm where others are reactive, stillness where others chase, certainty where others negotiate. When you remain grounded while emotions fluctuate around you, you create a reference point. And the mind is drawn to reference points because they provide orientation. She doesn't feel overwhelmed around you, she feels anchored. And anchoring is deeply seductive because it's rare. Most men talk too much because they're afraid silence will cost them interest. In reality, silence does the opposite. Silence gives her mind room to project, to replay interactions, to wonder. Words end curiosity, space extends it. When you're comfortable letting conversations breathe, ending them before they fade, you leave an impression that lingers instead of dissolves. Mental attraction isn't built by agreement, it's built by friction. Not argument, friction. A grounded difference in perspective, a calm refusal to bend, just to keep things smooth. When you don't mirror opinions automatically, you signal independence, and independence is what creates polarity. Polarity is what keeps the mind engaged long after the conversation ends. Another truth most men miss: emotional regulation is more attractive than emotional availability. You can be present without being porous. You can listen without absorbing everything. When you don't get pulled into every emotional wave, she starts noticing how stable you are. Stability doesn't bore the mind, it relaxes it. And when the mind relaxes, attachment deepens quietly. Seduction of the mind happens when she feels seen without feeling studied, when you notice patterns without interrogating them, when you respond to what's beneath her words instead of reacting to the words themselves. This makes her feel understood without being exposed. And that balance, being understood without losing control, is intoxicating. You don't need to escalate to create intensity. Intensity builds when you withhold resolution, when you don't rush to define things, when you allow tension to exist without anxiety. The mind doesn't crave certainty, it craves continuity. It wants something to return to. When you don't collapse the unknown too quickly, interest sustains itself naturally. Relatable truth: the men she remembers most weren't the loudest or the most attentive. They were the ones who didn't need her reaction to stay composed, the ones who didn't flinch when attention shifted, the ones who didn't chase when things slowed down, because those men made her feel something rare, emotional safety without emotional dependence. In the end, seducing the mind isn't about technique, it's about posture. A posture that says, I'm present, but I'm not seeking permission to exist. That posture creates curiosity. Curiosity leads to investment. Investment turns into attachment. And attachment formed this way doesn't feel forced, it feels inevitable. What most men don't realize is that the mind becomes attached before the heart ever does. Long before emotions deepen, her thoughts start looping. She replays small moments, a look you gave without explanation, a pause you didn't rush to fill, a decision you made without consulting her reaction. These moments lodge themselves quietly because they don't seek validation. The mind remembers what feels autonomous. It returns to what doesn't beg to be remembered. When you don't overreact to emotional shifts, you become unpredictable in the right way, not chaotic, steady. And steadiness stands out in a world of volatility. When others lean in emotionally every time energy changes, you remain composed. That composure becomes a contrast point. Her mind begins measuring others against you without consciously intending to. That comparison doesn't come from effort, it comes from impact. There's something deeply compelling about a man who doesn't need to dominate conversation to feel present. When you speak with intention and stop when there's nothing more to add, your words carry weight. Scarcity applies to language too. People value what isn't overused. The mind pays closer attention when it knows silence is possible. Mental attraction deepens when you allow disagreement without tension. You don't rush to persuade, you don't defend every position, you let differences exist calmly. That signals emotional confidence. Confidence relaxes the mind because it removes the threat of instability. She doesn't feel like she has to manage you, reassure you, or soften herself around you. That freedom is subtle but powerful. Relatable truth. The men who leave the deepest impression are usually the ones who didn't seem impressed by everything. Not dismissive. Selective. Selectiveness tells the mind that attention is earned, not distributed freely, and what is earned carries value. This isn't arrogance, it's discernment. Discernment keeps interest alive far longer than approval ever could. Another layer of influence comes from emotional pacing. You don't rush closeness, you don't escalate intensity prematurely. You allow curiosity to mature. That pacing creates anticipation, and anticipation is what keeps the mind engaged when you're not present. It's not what happens during interaction that matters most. It's what happens afterward, when she's alone with her thoughts. When you don't seek constant affirmation, you remove pressure from the dynamic. Pressure creates resistance. Ease invites openness. Her mind doesn't feel pushed to respond a certain way. That freedom allows genuine interest to surface instead of obligation. An interest that emerges freely attaches deeper. Seduction of the mind also requires restraint. Restraint in reaction, restraint in disclosure, restraint in availability, not as a strategy, but as a natural extension of having a full life. When your life has momentum, your availability becomes intentional instead of automatic. The mind notices intentionality. It interprets it as value. Men often underestimate how much emotional safety contributes to fascination. Safety isn't about predictability, it's about consistency of self. When she knows you won't collapse, overreact, or disappear emotionally, her mind relaxes around you. Relaxation allows attachment to deepen without fear. An attachment formed without fear lasts. By now, the pattern is clear. Mental attraction isn't forced, it's invited. You invite it by staying grounded, by not leaking need, by allowing space, and by letting curiosity do its work. When you move this way, interest doesn't spike and crash. It settles in, quietly, persistently. And once the mind settles somewhere, it's very hard to dislodge. At a certain point, influence stops being something you do and becomes something you are. It shows up in how you move through moments without urgency. You don't rush replies because you're not chasing momentum. You don't overextend because you're not afraid of pauses. This lack of urgency subtly reframes the dynamic. Her thoughts don't race because you're not racing. Instead, they circle back. They revisit. And whatever the mind revisits gains weight. Most men confuse intensity with depth. They think stronger emotion equals stronger connection, but the mind bonds through continuity, not spikes. Consistency without pressure builds a sense of reliability that doesn't feel dull, it feels safe. When interactions feel safe, the mind lowers its guard, and when the guard drops, attachment forms quietly, without the resistance that loud intensity creates. There's also power in not being emotionally available on demand. Availability that has structure signals a life with priorities. That structure isn't cold, it's grounding. She can sense when your attention isn't the centerpiece of your existence, and paradoxically, that makes it more valuable. Value doesn't come from constant presence. It comes from presence that's chosen. Relatable truth. The men who hold attention longest aren't the ones who try hardest. They're the ones who remain intact when circumstances shift. When energy dips, they don't scramble. When interest fluctuates, they don't interrogate. They let things breathe. And breathing room keeps curiosity alive far longer than reassurance ever could. Another subtle driver is emotional mirroring done sparingly. You don't echo every feeling. You acknowledge without absorbing. That distinction keeps you centered. It also creates a sense of emotional leadership. Leadership isn't dominance, it's steadiness. When someone feels steady around you, their mind relaxes into trust. Men often underestimate how much attraction grows when you don't chase closure. Not every interaction needs a conclusion. Not every moment needs definition. When you allow ambiguity without anxiety, you signal confidence in the process. Confidence in the process removes pressure from outcomes, and pressure is what kills fascination fastest. What keeps interest alive over time is not mystery for mystery's sake, it's depth that unfolds gradually. You don't reveal everything at once because you don't need to. You You let experiences accumulate. Shared moments carry more weight than declarations. The mind attaches to experiences, not promises. Another shift happens when you stop framing interest as something fragile. You don't handle it delicately, you handle it naturally. Fragility invites overprotection. Naturalness invites ease. Ease keeps interactions fluid. Fluid interactions don't feel forced. And what doesn't feel forced is remembered. Men who understand this stop performing. They stop calibrating every move for reaction. They trust their pace. That trust removes self-consciousness, and self-consciousness is what drains presence. Presence, when unforced, is felt immediately, even when nothing dramatic is happening. By now, the pattern is undeniable. Influence grows where restraint meets consistency, where calm replaces urgency, where interest is allowed to mature instead of being accelerated. When you live this way, attention doesn't spike and fade, it settles, and whatever settles into the mind becomes part of its landscape, not just a passing thought. Patience is the first thing that separates influence from neediness. When you're patient, you're not waiting for permission to exist, you're moving at your own pace. That pace communicates stability. Without saying a word, it tells her there's a life unfolding beyond the interaction, a direction that doesn't stall if attention wavers. The mind gravitates toward momentum, not chaos, not intensity. Momentum, and patience is what keeps momentum steady instead of desperate. Men often sabotage themselves by trying to resolve emotional tension too quickly. They rush to clarify, to label, to define, to secure. But tension is not a threat, it's fuel. When you don't panic around uncertainty, you allow tension to transform into curiosity instead of anxiety. Curiosity is what keeps thoughts returning when you're not present. Anxiety pushes them away. Another overlooked truth is how self-direction affects perception. When your decisions don't hinge on someone else's reaction, you appear grounded. Grounded people don't feel unpredictable, they feel solid, and solidity allows the mind to relax into trust without feeling trapped. That balance, freedom without instability, is rare, and rarity sharpens focus. Relatable truth: the moments that linger aren't the loud ones, they're the understated ones. A calm response when emotion spikes, a subtle boundary held without explanation, a decision made without consulting approval. These moments signal self-respect, and self-respect is contagious. It teaches others how to treat you without instruction. Men who learn this stop chasing emotional alignment and start living in behavioral alignment. They don't argue feelings, they watch consistency. They don't negotiate attraction, they allow it to reveal itself over time. This shift removes pressure from every interaction. Pressure dissolves curiosity, ease extends it. There's also power in not correcting every misinterpretation. You don't need to defend your intentions constantly. When you let actions speak across time, they carry more authority than explanations ever could. Authority isn't loud, it's cumulative. And cumulative impressions last longer than one-off performances. What keeps interest alive is not availability, it's discernment. You don't disappear, you don't overextend, you choose when and where to invest. That choice communicates value because it reflects priorities. Priorities signal direction. Direction anchors perception. The mind prefers anchors over noise. Men often think influence requires constant engagement. In reality, it requires rhythm, engagement followed by space, presence followed by absence, not as a tactic, but as a natural consequence of a full life. Rhythm prevents emotional saturation. Saturation dulls impact. Rhythm preserves it. As this becomes natural, you stop tracking reactions. You're no longer measuring interest through responses or timing. You're simply moving forward. Forward movement is magnetic because it doesn't wait to be validated. It invites participation without demanding it. Participation that's invited lasts longer than participation that's coerced. By this point, the foundation is set. Patience shapes perception, self-direction builds trust, and rhythm sustains curiosity. When you live from this place, attachment forms quietly, not from pressure, not from persuasion, but from consistency that feels safe, interesting, and real. Long after the moment has passed, there's a point where influence stops feeling like something external and starts coming from how settled you are within yourself. When you're no longer monitoring reactions, timing responses, or adjusting behavior to maintain interest, something subtle but powerful happens. You become internally still. That stillness transmits. It creates a contrast against emotional noise, urgency, and inconsistency that most people bring into interactions. The mind notices what feels calm without feeling empty. Calm without withdrawal feels rare, and rarity always draws attention. What most men don't realize is that mental attachment often forms when there's nothing to grab onto, when there's no over-explanation, no emotional flooding, no constant reassurance. The mind starts circling because it hasn't been given closure, not dramatic closure, psychological closure, and when the mind doesn't get it, it keeps returning, not out of anxiety but curiosity. Curiosity is quiet, it doesn't announce itself, it just lingers. A grounded man doesn't rush to align emotionally. He lets alignment reveal itself through shared experience. He understands that forced closeness creates resistance, while organic closeness creates trust. Trust doesn't arrive through words, it arrives through predictability of character. When someone knows you won't shift based on mood, pressure, or uncertainty, their thoughts begin to stabilize around you. Relatable truth: the people who occupy the most mental space are rarely the ones who tried hardest. They're the ones who didn't collapse under expectation. They didn't overcorrect when interest fluctuated. They didn't become different versions of themselves to maintain engagement. That consistency becomes a mental reference point, and reference points don't fade easily. Another layer of depth comes from emotional containment. You don't suppress emotion, you manage it. You don't spill frustration, excitement, or insecurity impulsively. You process before expressing. That containment signals maturity, and maturity is deeply compelling because it removes unpredictability without removing intensity. Men often confuse openness with exposure. They think sharing everything builds connection. In reality, discernment builds connection. Knowing what to share, when to share, and what to keep internal creates balance. Balance allows curiosity to coexist with safety, and when those two coexist, attachment deepens naturally. As you move this way, you stop seeking resonance in every interaction. You don't need constant agreement, emotional mirroring, or validation. You're comfortable letting others have their own experience while remaining centered in yours. That independence prevents emotional entanglement from turning into pressure. Pressure suffocates interest. Independence preserves it. What keeps thoughts returning is not unpredictability, it's reliability without predictability. Being reliable in character, but not emotionally scripted. You don't react the same way every time, because you're responding authentically, not strategically. Authentic response is what keeps interactions alive. Strategy becomes obvious over time. Authenticity doesn't. Men who understand this stop trying to create intensity and start allowing depth. Depth doesn't announce itself, it accumulates through calm presence, through steady decisions, through not disappearing emotionally when things slow down, and not overreaching when they accelerate. That balance makes the mind feel safe enough to attach without resistance. By now, the pattern is undeniable. Mental attraction grows, where pressure disappears, where self-direction replaces urgency, and where calm consistency replaces performance. When you live from this place, interest doesn't spike and vanish. It settles, and whatever settles into the mind becomes familiar, grounding, and difficult to forget. There comes a moment when you realize the most powerful shift wasn't in how she responded to you, but in how you stopped responding to uncertainty. You no longer needed signs, confirmations, or emotional guarantees to stay composed. That internal steadiness changes the entire dynamic because it removes the invisible tension most interactions carry. When you don't need outcomes to feel secure, your presence becomes lighter, and lightness is what allows interest to breathe instead of suffocate. What's deeply relatable is recognizing how often men mistake emotional effort for emotional impact. They give more, explain more, try harder, thinking intensity will create closeness, but intensity without grounding overwhelms. Grounding without intensity invites curiosity. When curiosity replaces pressure, the mind stays engaged naturally, without force or persuasion. A man who moves from internal alignment doesn't try to control perception. He allows perception to form. He understands that the strongest impressions are formed when people arrive at them on their own. When you stop guiding reactions, you give space for organic conclusions, and conclusions reached independently are trusted more deeply. Another quiet truth: people think about those who don't need to be thought about. When you're not trying to stay relevant, you become memorable. When you're not chasing attention, attention finds you. This isn't mysticism, it's psychology. The mind values what doesn't demand validation because it signals completeness. Men often underestimate how much restraint communicates strength. Not restraint as denial, but restraint as self-respect. You don't overshare to bond. You don't escalate to secure interest. You don't collapse boundaries to avoid discomfort. That restraint tells the mind there's depth beneath the surface, and depth invites exploration. Relatable truth: the strongest moments are often the quietest ones. The pause before responding, the choice not to argue, the decision to step back instead of leaning in. These moments don't feel dramatic, but they carry weight because they're intentional. Intentionality creates trust. Trust allows the mind to rest. As this becomes your default way of moving, you stop trying to be impressive. You're no longer performing confidence, you're living it. Performance requires energy, living doesn't. That ease shows up in posture, tone, timing, and decision-making. And ease is deeply disarming because it can't be faked consistently. Another shift happens when you stop associating closeness with proximity. You understand that emotional closeness doesn't require constant contact. It requires consistency of self. When someone feels the same around you every time, calm, grounded, unpressured, their mind associates you with stability. Stability doesn't dull interest, it anchors it. Men who reach this stage also stop fearing loss, not because they don't care, but because they trust themselves to be okay, regardless of outcome. That trust removes desperation from every interaction, and desperation is what repels far more than indifference ever could. By now, the realization is complete. Influence isn't built through pursuit, explanation, or emotional labor. It's built through self-direction, restraint, and consistency. When you live this way, interest doesn't need to be manufactured. It forms quietly, grows steadily, and lingers long after the moment passes. There's a moment when you realize that the strongest position you ever stepped into wasn't confidence, it was neutrality. Not emotional numbness, but emotional independence. You stopped leaning forward, hoping something would happen, and you stopped leaning back, pretending not to care. You simply stood where you were. That neutrality removes pressure from every interaction. When pressure disappears, authenticity shows up. And authenticity is what the mind trusts long before it ever attaches. Most men don't struggle because they lack appeal. They struggle because they broadcast need through their timing, tone, and reactions. They respond too fast, explain too much, and adjust themselves to preserve momentum. When you stop doing that, conversations stop feeling transactional. They become experiential, and the mind attaches to experiences, not exchanges. What quietly reshapes perception is how you handle moments of emotional imbalance. When excitement spikes, you don't escalate it recklessly. When interest dips, you don't chase it anxiously. You let things level themselves out. This ability to let energy regulate naturally signals inner control. Inner control is what makes people feel safe without feeling managed. Relatable truth: the men who leave the deepest impression are often the ones who didn't seem overly invested in being liked. They weren't distant, but they weren't auditioning either. That middle ground is powerful because it signals choice. Choice implies abundance, not of people, but of self-respect. And self-respect is always felt before it's understood. Another shift happens in how you view silence. Silence stops being awkward, it becomes informative. You notice who fills it with substance and who fills it with performance. You notice who grows curious and who grows uncomfortable. Silence reveals more than conversation ever could, and when you're comfortable inside it, others feel it too. Men often believe influence requires constant engagement. In reality, it requires consistency of character. When your reactions don't swing wildly, when your demeanor remains stable regardless of circumstance, the mind relaxes around you. Relaxation is what allows attachment to form without resistance. Nothing bonds deeply in a state of tension. What also changes is how you handle emotional disclosure. You don't unload to feel close. You share with intention. That intentional sharing creates pacing. Pacing allows depth to unfold instead of collapsing all at once. When depth unfolds gradually, it stays interesting. When it's dumped prematurely, it overwhelms and fades. Men who reach this stage stop trying to be unforgettable. They focus on being consistent. Consistency doesn't excite the nervous system, but it calms it. And what calms the nervous system becomes a place the mind returns to, not out of urgency, but out of comfort. You also stop framing connection as something you must protect at all costs. You allow it to evolve or dissolve naturally. That acceptance removes fear from your presence. Fear is loud, acceptance is quiet, and quiet confidence is what lingers in thought long after interaction ends. By now, it's clear that real influence isn't created. It's allowed by restraint, allowed by patience, allowed by a man who doesn't chase outcomes but moves forward regardless of them. When you live this way, attachment doesn't feel forced or dramatic, it feels natural, and what feels natural is rarely forgotten. At this stage, you stop seeing connection as something fragile that needs constant maintenance. You realize most things don't fall apart because they weren't protected, they fall apart because they were forced. When you stop forcing outcomes, interactions start revealing their true shape. Some deepen, some fade, and instead of panicking when something fades, you feel relief. Relief because clarity has replaced confusion, and clarity always costs less energy than hope. What becomes obvious is how much mental attraction is tied to emotional predictability. Not predictability in behavior, but predictability in character. When someone knows you won't suddenly become reactive, needy, or withdrawn, when circumstances change, their mind relaxes around you. That relaxation isn't boring, it's grounding. And grounded connections are the ones people return to when chaos exhausts them. Relatable truth. Many men were never unattractive. They were just too available emotionally. They were always on, always responsive, always accommodating. When you step back from that pattern, not to manipulate, but to rebalance, your presence regains weight. Weight isn't created by distance alone, it's created by intention. And intention is felt even when nothing is being said. You also stop measuring progress through emotional highs. You stop chasing sparks and butterflies. You start noticing something deeper. How comfortable silence feels, how natural time together becomes, how little effort it takes to stay aligned. These aren't flashy signals, but they're honest ones, and honesty is what the mind trusts long term. Men often think depth comes from intensity. In reality, depth comes from stability under pressure, how you handle moments that don't go your way, how you respond when interest fluctuates, how you move when things aren't perfectly aligned. Those moments define perception far more than your best behavior ever could. As this mindset settles in, you stop rehearsing conversations in your head. You stop strategizing every interaction. You show up as you are, knowing that who you are doesn't need constant adjustment. That authenticity removes friction from connection. Frictionless interactions don't feel dull, they feel real. Another shift is how you experience attachment. You no longer confuse attachment with obligation. You don't stay because you're afraid of losing momentum. You stay because alignment exists, and when alignment fades, you don't cling to memory. You respond to reality. That responsiveness keeps you grounded instead of trapped. What makes this approach unforgettable is that it doesn't try to be. You're not chasing impact. You're not leaving impressions on purpose. You're simply consistent in who you are, regardless of response. Consistency of self is rare, and rarity always stands out. Men who live this way don't become detached, they become selective. They don't withdraw emotionally, they regulate. They don't shut down, they stay centered. That centeredness becomes the emotional baseline others adjust to, not the other way around. And that quiet authority shapes perception without effort. By the time this lesson fully integrates, you're no longer trying to be wanted, you're focused on being aligned. And alignment does something powerful. It attracts what fits and repels what doesn't, without drama or explanation. What remains feels natural, steady, and real, and what leaves no longer shakes your sense of self. That's when influence stops being something you think about and becomes something others feel. Eventually, you notice something that changes how you see every interaction going forward. The moment you stopped trying to be something for her, she started experiencing you more deeply. Not because you withdrew, but because you stopped bending. You weren't adjusting your tone to keep peace. You weren't filtering your presence to maintain comfort. You simply existed as yourself, without asking for permission. That authenticity doesn't feel loud or aggressive, it feels solid. And solidity is what the mind trusts when everything else feels unstable. What most men don't understand is that fascination isn't created by intensity, it's created by continuity. By showing up as the same man across different emotional weather. Calm when things are light, calm when things are heavy, calm when nothing is happening at all. That emotional consistency creates an internal reference point. Her thoughts don't spiral around you because you're unpredictable. They settle around you because you're dependable without being boring. Relatable truth. Many men try to keep interest alive by constantly refreshing themselves. New stories, new energy, new effort. But what actually keeps someone mentally engaged is not novelty, it's coherence. When your words, actions, and boundaries all line up over time, the mind relaxes. And when the mind relaxes, it stops scanning for threats and starts attaching naturally. Another realization hits hard. The more you try to secure a place in someone's life, the less space they have to choose you freely. Choice matters. When someone feels they're choosing you, not being pulled toward you, their investment feels real to them. An investment that feels self-directed is the kind that lasts. Men often think they lose influence when they stop explaining themselves. In reality, explanations dilute presence. When you don't narrate your intentions or defend every decision, your actions gain weight. Weight comes from consistency, not commentary. And the mind always prioritizes what carries weight over what makes noise. As this mindset settles in, you stop chasing emotional reassurance. You don't need confirmation that things are good. You observe how things feel over time. That long-view perspective protects you from reacting to temporary fluctuations. And reacting less doesn't make you indifferent, it makes you composed. What becomes clear is that mental attachment isn't about feeling excited all the time. It's about feeling steady. Steady enough to think clearly. Steady enough to be yourself. Steady enough to not overcorrect when uncertainty shows up. That steadiness creates emotional safety without control. And emotional safety without control is rare. Men who reach this stage stop fearing silence, distance, or pauses in communication. They understand that meaningful connections don't dissolve in quiet moments. Weak ones do. When something is real, it survives space. When it's not, space reveals that quickly. Either way, clarity wins. The surprising part is how much lighter life feels once you stop trying to manage perception. You're no longer carrying the weight of being interesting enough. You're just present. And presence, when unforced, is deeply felt. It doesn't shout, it lingers. By the time you arrive here, the lesson is complete. Influence isn't something you apply. It's something you embody. You don't chase connection. You don't force outcomes. You move forward with intention. Allow others to meet you there, and let reality decide the rest. Whatever stays feels genuine. Whatever leaves no longer takes your peace with it. And that's when your presence becomes unforgettable. Not because you tried, but because you were real.